My friends, this is the last in this series of reports on the 88th Congress. They began in January of 1963. That means that it covers both the first and the second sessions of this Congress. I hope they've been informative. I hope they've been interesting. And I do want to express my gratitude and appreciation to the station operators and to all of their staffs, because they've been very kind indeed. They've made these programs available as a public service, and I bring them in that spirit. We've taken some pains, of course, to try to keep ahead of the parade of events wherever possible, so that you might have some background against which to measure the various proposals that were under consideration, both in the House and in the Senate. Now, the reason this is a final report is because it's customary to chop this off about this time of the year. There are a good many intrusions, of course. There comes summer, when people are busy with their own devices. And then we'll have the two national conventions intruding. The first of them, the Republican Convention at San Francisco, which begins on July 13th. Then comes the Democrat Convention at Atlantic City, which begins on August 24. We shall be coming back from San Francisco because there will still be a lot of unfinished work. It is hoped, of course, that in the month between the Republican and Democrat conventions, that we can finally consummate our labors and then bring about sine die adjournment until the next session of the Congress. Now, the new Congress will begin in January of 1965. Under the Constitution, it would normally start on the 3rd of January, unless Congress fixes a different date. Well, it so happens that January 3 falls on a Sunday, so at best it would come Monday, but it's more likely to come, let us say, on Tuesday, January 5. But when this Congress adjourns, sine die, which means without an appointed day, everything falls. All the bills on the calendar die. All the bills on the committee calendars die. And it's fair to assume, of course, that many of them, in fact thousands of them, will be reintroduced when the 89th Congress comes into session next January. Now, when this Congress began in January of 1963, there was a great deal of fever, a great deal of disservice, a great deal of discord everywhere in the world. You remember back, I'm sure, that the Berlin Wall was a lively issue. So was Cuba, and Cuba, of course, is still there. We had this problem out in Asia, in Laos, and in Vietnam, and those are spirited problems today. We had problems in the Congo, and in Morocco, and in Algiers, as well as in other sections of the world. So it wasn't exactly a hot war. It wasn't quite a cold war. Maybe a better term would be to refer to it as a cold peace. That's about the best you could say for it. But on the home front, there was neither doom nor gloom, nor was there boom. Actually, the country was moving sideways. We had a large unemployment quotient, and no real dent had been made in it. We had the problem of school aid and a great many other things at that time. And so we moved into the first session, and when it was over, there were quite a number of things that were achieved. I note, for instance, the Test Ban Treaty. I think of the cuts that were made in appropriations, the money that the Congress voted for construction for the colleges of the country. We set up military health centers. We made a military pay increase across the board for everybody who was in the armed services. And then there was an equal pay bill, which equalized the pay as between men and women in any line of work, with some exceptions. At that time, we also got out legislation to expedite an arbitration of the rail dispute, which was pending at that time. But of course, there were some things that were resisted too in that first session. One was that Congress refused to be hurried so far as the tax bill was concerned. They refused to be hurried with respect to the Civil Rights Bill. We did pass out a measure dealing with area relief development, and with quite a little money attached to that bill. But there were such things as cotton and wheat controls, and Medicare, and increases in foreign aid, all of which did not eventuate in that first session of the 88th Congress. I think at that time there was a new emphasis in the Congress. It was more nearly on such things as frugality and on thrift. The emphasis was on the solvency and the security of our country. And there was real emphasis on the elimination of waste in government, which everybody knew existed. It could scarcely be otherwise in a government so big and so sprawling as this, but at least an effort was made through the reduction of expenditures and the reduction of appropriations to bring about an elimination of that waste. In that first session, of course, there was that frightful dark shadow that fell athwart our labors. That was the assassination of President Kennedy on the 22nd of November, 1963. Truly, the world went into mourning, and what a heinous and ghastly thing it really was. But there was a new president, and the transition from the late president to the new president was rather smooth and not marked with difficulty, and it shows the vitality of our government, and I think it shows the tolerance and the patience of our people. And so the session that closed at the end of the year closed on a somewhat dispirited note. There was a wrangle on appropriations, there was a wrangle on foreign aid, and we finally had to adjourn and come back for one day in January, just the day before the new session, namely the second session of the 88th Congress began. Now, in this second session, you still had these fevers abroad. Cuba is still there, and it's still a problem. The Berlin Wall is still there, and it is still a problem for the free world. We are probably having greater difficulty in Asia than ever before. Not only has there been an eruption in the little country of Laos, but we have more than $3 billion of American money invested in Vietnam. And I can see no improvement in the situation as I read the dispatches and come abreast with whatever news I can that is dealing with that problem at the present time. Now at home in this session, we did finish our labors on the tax bill. And I think in the main, it was a fairly good bill. But while the House went on to finish its labors on appropriations, mass transit, and other measures, the Senate got bogged down in civil rights, and we had it on our hands for nearly 100 days. But there again, after applying probably 70 or more amendments to the House version of the bill, we finally secured cloture in the Senate and finally passed the bill. It now goes back to the House, but I'm confident that the House will accept the Senate version and that there will be a bill for the President's signature before too long. We've gotten out the grist mainly. The appropriation bills will be passed. We have concluded work on the debt limit, and we've now raised our public debt limit to the astronomical sum of $324 billion. The wheat cotton bill, which was certainly not to my liking, and which foundered in the first session of the Congress, finally went from the Senate back to the House and was ultimately enacted into law. The Senate passed this mass transit bill, which involves a matter of $500 million in grants and credits, and it languished in the House for a long time. But it's back, and I would assume, all things being equal, that it also will finally be enacted into law. Now, the Medicare bill seems to have been shelved so far as the House of Representatives is concerned. We did that once before. But before this session concludes, it is not impossible, nor is it improbable, that some member of the Senate may offer a new Medicare bill as an amendment to any other bill that may be on the calendar. We do not have in the Senate what is known as the germaneness rule. By that I mean, if you're going to offer an amendment to some bill, it's got to be reasonably relevant to that bill. It has to deal with the same subject matter, and it's got to fit, so to speak. In the House of Representatives, they have such a rule. In the Senate, we don't. So you could take Medicare and add it to a school bill, or you could have added it to civil rights if anybody had been so disposed. But they have not been, and it may well be that there'll be no further action in the Medicare field before this session comes to an end. There was one other controversial measure in the Senate Banking Committee that in fact caused quite a controversy. Hearings were held over a period of 4 years, I think, not only in Washington, but in different sections of the country. But as I recall, last week the Banking Committee subcommittee finally decided to report adversely on the bill. So I would gather that there will be no action on the so-called Truth in Lending bill, nor on the so-called Truth in Packaging bill, which is still languishing in the Judiciary Committee of the Senate. So much was resisted, and a fairly good amount of legislation was achieved. When the session concludes, I suppose the statisticians will come forth, and they'll seek to measure what the Congress undertook, what its endeavors covered, how many pages were filled in the congressional record, how many bills were passed, how many bills were introduced, and I would gather that by now the number must be at least 20,000 for the 88th Congress. And then, of course, there'll always come those comparisons of what did labor get, what did the farmer get, what did business get, and so forth. They chop it into very fine compartments and seek to measure it in that fashion. But this must be said about the 88th Congress, including, of course, the long filibuster on civil rights. It was diligent, and it went about its labors in the hope that it could achieve some real good for the country, and I believe that has been done. So farewell, so far as these reports are concerned, until we resume in January of 1965.